Welcome to a lesson that belongs to the Test with Spring course. The title of this lesson is Writing Unit Tests for a REST API with Kotlin and JUnit 5 Part 1 configuration, and this lesson has two goals. After we have finished this lesson, we understand how we can eliminate duplicate code from our test suite, and we can configure the system-under test by using the standalone configuration. Let's begin. We don't want to add duplicate code to our test suite because it makes our tests hard to write and maintain. During this lesson, we will learn two techniques which help us to eliminate duplicate code from our test suite when we are writing unit tests for Spring MVC controllers. Next, we will learn how we can create the components which override the default configuration provided by the Spring MVC Test framework. As we remember, if we create the required components in our test classes, we add duplicate code to our test suite because it's likely that multiple test classes use the same configuration. That's why we have to create an object MockK class that creates the required components. We can create our object MockK class by following these steps. First, we have to create a new class and ensure that we cannot instantiate the created class. Second, we have to write the static factory functions which create and configure the required components. We have to add 3 static factory functions to our object MockK class. 1. The fixed local resolve function returns a new fixed local resolve object that always returns local.english. It's a good idea to use a fixed local because it ensures that the environment in which our tests are run cannot cause false positives, aka test failures. Two, the object mapper function creates and configures a new object mapper object. We add this logic to a new function because we will use this function when we create the JSON document that's sent to the system-under test. And 3. The object mapper HTTP message converter function creates a new mapping Jackson2 HTTP message converter object that can read and write JSON by using Jackson. Let's move on and find out how we can create a request builder class which sends HTTP requests to the system-under test. When we write tests for a real-life web application or a REST API, we notice that every test function creates a new HTTP request and sends it to the system under test. This is a bad situation because duplicate code makes our tests hard to write and maintain. We can solve this problem by using request builder classes. A request builder class is a class that fulfills these conditions. 1. It contains functions which create and send HTTP requests to the system under test by using a mock MVC object. And 2. Every function must return a result actions object which allows us to write assertions for the returned HTTP response. When we want to write a new request builder class, we have to follow these steps. 1. Create a new class. 2. Add a primary constructor to the created class. And 3. Ensure that the primary constructor declares a private mock MVC property which has no getter or setter. Our request builder class will use this property when it creates and sends HTTP requests to the system under test. By the way, this request builder class is useless because we didn't write the functions which create and send HTTP requests to the system under test. We will talk more about request builder classes when we learn to write unit tests for a REST API. We have now created the components which help us to eliminate duplicate code when we are writing unit tests for a REST API. Next, we will learn to configure the system under test by using these components. Before we can configure the system under test, we have to select the size of the tested unit. When developers write unit tests, quite often they use as small unit size as possible. This means that developers replace the dependencies of the tested class with test tuples. The problem of this approach is that we might end up writing shallow unit tests, especially if the tested class has no business logic. For example, if we are writing unit tests for a Spring MVC controller and we replace its dependencies with test tuples, we cannot write unit tests for our business logic. We can only ensure that 1. Our HTTP request is processed by the correct controller function. 2. Our validation rules are working as expected. 3. The correct data is passed forward to the expected service function. And 4. The system under test returns the expected HTTP response. This time we are going to do something totally different. We will increase the size of the tested unit and replace the dependencies of our service component with test tuples. The goal of this experiment is to help us to see if this approach helps us to write more meaningful unit tests for a Spring REST API. We can now configure the system under test by following these steps. First, we have to create a new test class and ensure that its test functions are run when we run our unit tests. Second, we have to add 3 private and late init properties to our test class. 1. The person finder class finds person data from the database. 2. The task repository class provides CRUD operations for tasks. And 3. The task CRUD request builder class creates HTTP requests and sends these requests to the system under test. Third, we have to add a new setup function to our test class and ensure that this function is invoked before a test function is run. Fourth, we have to implement our setup function by following these steps. 1. Create person finder and task repository mocks and store the created mock objects in the person finder and repository properties. 2. Create a new task CRUD service object and store the created object in a local variable. 3. Create a new mock MVC object by using the standalone configuration and store the created object in a local variable. And 4. Create a new task CRUD request builder object and store the created object in the request builder property. We can now configure the system under test by using the standalone configuration. Let's summarize what we learned from this lesson. This lesson has taught us that 1. We can configure the system under test without writing duplicate code by using an object mother class that creates and configures all components which are added to the system under test. 2. We can send HTTP requests to the system under test without writing duplicate code by using a request builder class. And 3. If we want to configure the system under test by using the standalone configuration, we have to invoke the standalone setup method of the mock MVC builders class. That's all for now. Thank you for watching.